everyone! So for my 5-minute video, I wanted to teach you guys a little about something I'm super passionate about, and that is Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare, but I know so many people who feel like they can't get into it because they have trouble understanding the language. Now, I'm not going to deny that understanding Elizabethan English can be tricky. I use footnotes all the time, and occasionally I'll even get a footnote that says something like, even professional scholars don't have a good explanation for this line. But I wanted to take the time to explain one basic concept that comes up a lot in Shakespeare and other works from that era: how to use the word thou. This is something I see people get confused by all the time, but it's actually pretty simple. Now, I think people sometimes have a misconception that thou is like a fancy way to say you because it's associated with old and supposedly highbrow texts, but thou is actually an informal, singular, second-person pronoun. If you speak Spanish, it's the equivalent of tu, or tu in French. It's for when you're addressing one person in an informal way. And this means it can have a few different connotations depending on the context. If you use thou with your wife, you're probably being sweet and intimate, but if you use thou with the king, then it's super insulting. Like any pronoun, thou has a few forms. Thou is the subject form. So it's used when the person you're referring to is the one doing something. But if the person that you're talking to is the object or is the one having something done to them, then you have to use the. This is kind of confusing because in English, the subject and object forms of you are you and you. But you can think about the difference between like he versus him. So it's, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Shakespeare is the one comparing the young man, so he's the object and thee is used, but the young man is the one who is more lovely and more temperate, the subject, which means that thou is used. Thy is the equivalent of your, used when talking about something that belongs to the person you're talking to. And thine is the equivalent of yours, so you would say, this is thy necklace, but this necklace is thine. Thine is also used as your for words that start with a vowel or a silent H. So thy necklace and thy shirt, but thine eyes and thine honor. There's also equivalent of yourself, which is just thyself. Like in modern English, you can also use thou to precede calling someone something. We might say, you idiot, and in Shakespeare you'll find thou used the same way, like in thou elvish marked abortive rooting hog. Yeah. So, now that you understand the basic forms of thou, let's talk about how to conjugate the thou form of verbs. One mistake I see all the time is people using an eth or eth ending for thou, saying something like thou sayest. That ending is actually reserved for third-person singular pronouns like he and she. So he saith or she saith is correct, but thou has a different ending, which is est. Thou sayest or thou knowest. Side note, you might also see thou conjugation spelled without an e, but it's still the same thing. Spelling at the time was just not very standardized, so both were used, it doesn't really matter. Pronunciation can also differ, especially in Shakespeare because he was writing mostly in verse. You might say thou sayest or thou sayst, depending on what's going to fit the meter better. There are also 5 irregular verbs to know when using thou that you kind of just have to memorize. There's to be, which is actually irregular with every pronoun in English, so it's not too different. For thou, it's thou art instead of you are, so thou art beautiful. You have becomes thou hast 2 children, or thou hast killed him. You do is thou dost. Do I live near the park? Yes, thou dost. It's not thou doest, it's dost, 1 syllable. You shall is thou shalt. Not used too often these days, but back then it was more common. Thou shalt live a long life, or for you will, thou wilt. Pretty much the same usage as thou shalt, thou wilt live a long life. I should also note there are times when you don't have to conjugate the verb in the thou form, and that's when you're using a command. In Elizabethan England, you could say things like, go you to the castle, meaning just go to the castle. If you're doing that with thou, there's no need to conjugate. Go thou to the castle, if it's a command. Otherwise, if it's a question or something, goest thou to the castle? hopefully that was a nice introduction on how to use thou. I know reading 400-year-old texts can be pretty intimidating, but once you learn a few simple rules like this, it's a lot easier to get through them. Thanks for watching!